Strange driver. It was the early 90s. At that time, my uncle lived in a village and often went to a neighboring village to visit a married woman. Usually he got there by bus. And one night, the lady's husband came back early and found them together. A fight ensued, after which the enraged husband kicked my uncle out the door. It was late in the street. The buses weren't running. I had to walk home about 2 hours, if not more. The road between the villages is deserted, especially at night. Almost no one drives there, except for occasional travelers. He was walking, and suddenly he heard a noise behind him. Not the roar of an engine, but the quiet rustling of tires on the asphalt. He looked back. An old truck was slowly rolling along the road, and it was driving with its headlights off. Uncle decided to wave his hand in case it stopped. The truck drove forward a little, but then stopped. A man leaned out of the window and offered a ride. The uncle climbed into the cab, and then the strange things began. First, it was dark in the cab, and the driver could barely be seen. Secondly, there was a strange odor in the air, dampness and river water. The uncle tried to make conversation and asked why the driver was driving without lights and why there was such an odor in the car. The man explained that his drunken partner had driven into the river and drowned the car. The truck was pulled out and dried, but the electrics were in disrepair. They could barely start the engine, and the headlights still don't work. Now he's on his way to the mechanics to look for parts. Uncle nodded. Tension did not let go. He paid attention to the driver's hands, wiry, with protruding veins, with unusually long fingers. However, one could put it down to his profession. Truckers are often like that. They continue driving, the uncle tells jokes, the driver laughs. And then in his strangeness, his teeth are too white, literally shining. For a countryman, it's somehow atypical. Suddenly, the driver asks a question. Why aren't you afraid to get in my car? Times are scary nowadays. You don't know who gets caught at night. Uncle grinned. If fate decides that I'm finished, then so be it. And I'm not a simple man. I used to box. I'll fight back. The driver hummed and asked another question, but not a man can fight back. The uncle hesitated. The driver just grinned. Come on, just kidding. I just don't know who you can meet at night. Meanwhile, they came to the turnoff to the uncle's village. The road there was bad. The truck shook on the potholes. Suddenly, something clicked on the side of the truck. When he reached the crossroads, the uncle thanked the driver. Thanks for the ride. Lucky me. But the driver didn't show his hand. He just smiled a strange smile and said, You just don't realize how lucky you are. Uncle got out and headed towards the village. The driver, too, got out of the cab to close the latch. At that moment, the uncle heard the sound of the board locking and, giving into instinct, turned around and froze. The driver stood by the body and looked after him. Only his eyes, they were burning. They did not reflect the light, did not shine, but glowed like two small lanterns with red bulbs. Uncle got a shiver, and the driver laughed. You run along, or I'll change my mind. As you can see, I don't really need headlights. Be careful at night, or next time you won't be so lucky. Uncle took off and ran without a backward glance, and the strange driver slowly got into the truck and drove off into the darkness. Who or what was he? Fuck knows. A baby on the road? This story was told to me by my uncle, so I have no reason not to trust it. And his intonation, the abundant amount of meat in the story, and most importantly, the fear in his voice hinted at the fact that everything happened in reality. Now to the story itself. Uncle was returning from work on a deserted road. No streetlights, no oncoming cars, only darkness and the sparse silhouettes of trees on both sides of the highway. The time was nearing 11 o'clock in the evening. The moon was covered with clouds. The only source of light was the motorcycle headlights. The forest along the road is tall and thick, stretching for kilometers, a deafening, oppressive silence. Sometimes it is broken by the crackling of branches in the depths of the forest, as if someone is walking parallel to the road. Sometimes there are unintelligible sounds, either the cries of night birds or something else. Unpleasant sensation, but not to say that something supernatural. The forest is full of animals. Because of the darkness, potholes on the road, and the fact that at any moment some animal could run out, my uncle drove slowly, no more than 60 kilometers per hour. And everything would be all right. But after a couple of minutes, something happened that made him avoid that stretch of road for the rest of his life. In the distance, he heard a baby crying. At first, he thought it was the cry of a bird, as forest animals do not make many sounds. But the farther he drove, the clearer it became. It was definitely a child. The crying grew louder. I don't know what drove him, but he decided to find the source of the sound. Perhaps he thought someone had dumped the baby in the woods and it was still alive. The sound was getting stronger. A little more, and his uncle saw in the headlights a white bundle on the side of the road. His heart sank into his heels. Is it really a baby? Ran through his mind. His uncle braked sharply, stopping 5 meters away from the bundle. He jumped off the bike and ran over. Carefully took the baby in his arms. Everything was like a real baby. The weight, the soft skin, the warmth of a small body. For a second, the uncle even smiled. The creature he held in his arms spoke, in a low, inhuman voice, the kind that could only be created by computer programs. And it said one word, "Run." My uncle flinched. The world seemed to shrink into a single point. The blood pounded in his temples. And then the creature added another word, louder than before. "If you want to live." What happened next, Uncle remembers badly. His brain just shut down from the horror. Reflexively, he threw the bundle on the roadside, rushed to the motorcycle, started it with half a turn, and, without looking around, at full speed rushed forward. He drove until he reached the house. Only there, behind the closed door, he realized what had happened. Ever since then, he's been driving that stretch of road as fast as he can, and he never looks over his shoulder. Humpbacked horse. It was 1990, at the beginning of the second hour of the morning. My father and his brother were driving along the highway leading to the old village. Everything was quiet. They were telling jokes, listening to music. And suddenly, in the light of headlights, they noticed a young guy of about 25 years old, running along the curb in the opposite direction. When he saw the car, he suddenly stopped and stared at them. But he didn't vote, didn't wave his arms, he just stood there. The uncle decided to slow down and ask if something was wrong. Father was indignant. "Are you completely sick? Who runs alone on the highway in the middle of the night without a flashlight? Maybe he's a robber or a murderer or something worse. Get out of here." But the uncle, a very kind man, got out of the car and called the guy. And that's when the weirdness started. The guy was standing by the car and crying a lot. He didn't look like a bum or a drug addict. Neat, light red hair combed back, light stubble, brown coat. "Did you have an accident?" Uncle asked, but the stranger only continued to sob, which made both of them uncomfortable. "What happened? Are you lost?" added the father, though a grown man would hardly weep over such a trifle. "No," the boy said through his sobs. "I'm afraid of him. I must be a sinner. It's after me." He fell to his knees, covered his face with his hands, and sobbed again. Father and brother looked at each other. The situation was dire, to say the least. "Calm down, boy. Who's chasing you?" his uncle asked, trying to lift him up. The father said quietly to his brother, "The situation is very strange. Let's just leave now." But then the boy suddenly stopped sobbing. He slowly raised his head and whispered, "A horse with a hump. It's waiting for me behind the tree." Father and uncle looked at the tree 40 meters away, but saw no one there. Father smirked and said, "The guy is drunk." "There's no one there," said the uncle. "Have you been drinking? Let us take you home." I don't want anything, the boy whispered through his tears. I've already lived my life. I guess my sins are heavy. That's why that thing is running after me. You go on through the pasture. Don't sin. Pray for me. It's gonna come after me again soon. And with these words, he turned and ran sobbing back into the darkness. Brother and father got into the car in silence. They thought about what had happened for a minute, and then the father asked, "What was that?" "I don't know, and I don't want to know," the uncle replied. They rode in silence until my father suddenly remembered the stranger's advice. Why did he send us to the pasture? There is no road there. He probably thought we were going to Plevo. There are 2 roads leading there, one through the highway and the other through the pasture, replied the uncle. By 4 in the morning, they reached the village without incident. In the morning, my father told my grandmother about the strange guy who had told about the humpbacked horse. Grandmother frowned. Humpback horses chase the soul of a man who has sinned a lot in his lifetime. They lead him to the other world. After that, neither uncle nor father could sleep well for a week. But the most interesting thing happened on the way back to town. Driving not far from where they met the guy, they noticed a tow truck. On its platform was a horribly mangled car. They stopped and asked the driver, "Where was the accident?" "On a blind bend near Plevo," he replied. The car had hit a truck. The driver of the truck was not hurt, but the driver of the car was killed. Too bad, he was young. The locals know that it is better to go through the pasture, not on the highway. Wasn't he a redhead? My father suddenly asked. In a brown coat? Yes, a redhead. Did you know him? Dad didn't answer. He started the car and drove on. In the Mari forests. My uncle told a story that happened to him in the winter when he was traveling home from the forest. The following is from his words. I was almost out of the forest and decided to stop for a drink. I stood on the side of the road. To the right is a field, and on the left, about 500 meters away, a dark forest. As soon as I got out of the car, I saw 2 sticks sticking out of the ground on both sides of the road, parallel to each other, and at their ends were cow skulls. I tensed up, but still decided to do my job. When I finished, I went to the car and it wouldn't open, not a sound around. There's no wind, the birds are silent, only my footsteps and the keys in my hands. I tensed up even more, and then the car started screaming. The alarm went off by itself. I pressed the key, no reaction. It screamed for a few seconds and then shut down. The door finally opened. I got in the car and felt I had to leave, and quickly. But the car won't start. I tried 3 times, nothing. 4th time, nothing. Only from the 5th time it started, and then I started to shake. I felt as if something terrible was about to happen. I got out of there as soon as possible. My uncle wasn't lying, and my grandfather always told me that something terrible was going on in the Mari forests. His hands were below his knees. We were just riding with a friend in his car, not thinking about anything, driving on an empty road. Suddenly, we saw a car in the ditch up ahead, and next to it, a man. He looked ordinary, but he was covered in blood. He got out of the car, staggering. His face was broken. We stopped to help. "Are you all right?" I asked, "Do you need help?" The man was silent. He didn't even seem to realize where he was. We looked inside the car, and there was no one inside but him, so he was the driver. We decided not to leave him alone, so we called the ambulance and the police. While we were waiting, the man regained consciousness. He looked at us and suddenly said, "I beat him to death, I guess." He flew into the ditch. "Who did?" The man nodded silently toward the ditch. "The body. Look in the grass." We looked at each other, but we went to check out the crash site. We shined flashlights, walked along the road, but we didn't find anyone. No body, no blood. When we got back to the driver, he finally told us what had happened. He was coming home from the country house. The road was empty, with only trees along the side of the road. Suddenly, the figure of a man appeared ahead. He was walking straight along the side of the road, and the closer the car came, the more the driver got a strange feeling. When the distance was reduced to a few meters, he realized what was the matter. The man was tall, about 2 meters, but his hands, they hung down below his knees, and they weren't the sleeves of a sweatshirt or anything like that. No, they were his arms. The driver slowed down to get a better look at the strange pedestrian, and that's when he made a sharp turn, and then he jumped right onto the hood. Sticky, unnaturally long fingers slammed into the windshield, black holes in the place of eyes staring directly at the driver. His face, completely white, no hair, no nose, just empty slits in place of mouth and eyes. In a panic, he yanked the steering wheel sideways. The car skidded. In a split second, he lost control and went into a ditch. He should have stayed on the road, the driver repeated in a whisper, or fly off after the car, but there was no body. Soon the ambulance and the police arrived. The paramedics examined the victim. The police illuminated the crash site, but no one and nothing was found, not on the road, not in the grass. Passenger. This story was told to me by a trucker I know. He was driving along a highway at night. There were no towns, no villages, no other cars around. Just an empty road and darkness outside the windows. Sleep was coming on. Eyes were slipping, yawning made his jaw drop time after time. Suddenly he saw a man ahead, right on the side of the road. He was standing at the edge of the road, and he was voting, asking him to stop. The trucker slowed down. He looked around. No one. No cars, no houses, just a bare field by the road. Kind of scary. But he opened the window and asked, "Where are you going?" A man came closer. He looked to be in his 40s, plain clothes. "I'm hitchhiking," he replied. "The last driver dropped me off here because he was turning the other way." The trucker thought for a while, but finally decided not to leave the man in the middle of the night. He opened the door, and the man climbed into the cab and sat in the passenger seat. "Let's go." At first, the conversation was brisk. We chatted for about 10 minutes. Then there was silence. The trucker saw his traveling companion with his side vision, but paid almost no attention to him. And now he was entering the city. Turns to ask where to drop off his passenger, and then, "There's no one in the seat, it's empty. The drowsiness is gone." The trucker braked sharply, turned around, looked around the cabin. No one? Where did he go? Checked the door, closed. He stopped, got out, looked around the road, not a soul. The trucker stood smoking on the side of the road for a while, then got back in the car and drove on, thinking about what had happened. He came to the only explanation. It was probably just a dream from lack of sleep. But from then on, he never picked up a hitchhiker again. Sleeping in an abandoned village. You all know abandoned villages. Maybe you've seen people exploring one on YouTube. Anyway, my dad decided to buy a car. We had to go to another town. We took the train and we drove there in 2 days. We bought the car and drove back in the evening. At 11 o'clock at night, we found ourselves in the middle of the highway. At first, we wanted to spend the night in the car, so my father pulled over to the side of the road. In the light of the headlights, we noticed an overgrown road and decided to drive deeper, just in case. While driving, we saw a village. My father went for a reconnaissance, came back and said that it was definitely abandoned. We spread the seats, ate, and went to bed. In the middle of the night, I wake up wanting to take a piss, and I hear someone pulling on the door handle. I looked out the window. It was dark. I couldn't see anything. I pushed my father. "Dad, someone's pulling on the doorknob." He woke up immediately, heard it too, and he yelled, "I'll come out and rip your head off." No reaction. But they started yanking even harder. My father quickly started the car and turned on the headlights. Since they were yanking from my side, I saw a big figure, 6 feet tall, black as soot. Even the headlights didn't light it up. My dad saw it too, and he accelerated. When we turned around, there was no one there. We drove on, adrenalized. Next time we stopped at a motel. I don't know who the hell it was. Maybe some scumbags in the village, maybe a bear. But as a fact, both me and my father were really scared. Woodchopper. Who remembers 2010? Back then, fires were raging in the Russian forests. Peat bogs were burning, and thick, acrid smoke enveloped everything around. I was on a public bus. We were traveling slowly, visibility was almost nil. And then I noticed something strange. Out of the woods comes a stump. A stump? Let me explain. It was a small stump, but it was moving. It was really moving on its roots like a spider on its legs. And it was moving very fast. It came out of the thicket, went straight to the roadside pond, and plunged into the water. The driver braked sharply at that moment. I turned to him. "Did you see that?" "I did," he replied. I offered to get out and pull the stump out of the water to see what the hell was going on. But then suddenly the grandmother who was traveling with us shouted, "Do not touch it. It's an arborealist. You'll bring bad luck on yourself." We looked at each other, and the grandmother was already baptizing and said that even if we took him out, he would look like an ordinary tree stump. So we got out of the car and came closer. There was indeed an ordinary stump floating in the puddle among the reeds. But it was not easy to get to it. There was a swamp all around. We decided that if on the way back it remained in place, then we would think what to do. We got back on the bus, and the grandmother said, "You don't understand. Fire drives all kinds of evil from the forest, and you only bring trouble on yourselves." Maybe he came to cool off, to hide from the fire. Then she remembered a story from her childhood. Before the war, I had an uncle who worked in the woods. One day, 2 of his buddies burned to death in his bathhouse in a drunken rage. After the funeral, he came to my mother, well, that is, to mine, and said, "Nin, I'm going to burn up soon." She asked why, and he replied, "We burned down a woodcutter with the woodcutters. Now the same fate awaits us all." It turned out that they were working far away in the forest, and suddenly one of the woodcutters, Nikolai, noticed a stump on roots moving across the clearing. He gasped with surprise and called the others. 2 others ran up, and they too saw the stump moving. One even said that it had a yellow eye. When all the others came up, the stump froze. They thought that Nikolai was joking, but they decided to drag the stump to the camp. At first they poked it with axes, threw knives, nothing. And then someone suggested we burn it, so we said and did it. We built a fire, threw the stump into the fire. At first nothing happened, but when it went up in flames, a terrible scream came out of it. The roots twitched, the limbs cracked, and he tried to climb out of the fire. But he didn't have time. The men, of course, were shocked, but they decided not to tell anyone. Well, who would believe it? Only after that, all 6 of them who burned him really burned. Some in a fire, some in a house, and my uncle in a tank in the war.